The rain was coming down in sheets that Tuesday evening, turning the highway into a glistening river of reflected headlights. Tom wiped his tired eyes, the clock on his dashboard showing 7:45 p.m. After pulling a 12-hour shift at Pete's auto shop, his body ached for the comfort of his couch, but something caught his attention through the rain-streaked windshield. There, on the shoulder of Highway 16, a small figure hunched over a flat tire, struggling with a wrench that seemed too big for their hands. Most cars zipped past, sending sprays of water in their wake. Tom felt that familiar tug in his chest, the same one his grandfather had taught him to listen to. "Always stop for someone in trouble," the old man used to say, "because one day it might be you standing there in the rain." Without overthinking it, Tom flicked on his hazard lights and carefully pulled over about 20 feet ahead of the stranded car. Grabbing his trusty waterproof jacket, a Christmas gift from his mom that had finally come in handy, he stepped out into the downpour. As he approached, he saw a young woman in hospital scrubs, her hair plastered to her face from the rain. She had been trying to loosen the lug nuts for what must have been ages, judging by her soaked clothes and frustrated expression. "Need a hand?" Tom called out over the sound of passing traffic and rain. The woman looked up, relief washing over her face, though he could see a hint of caution in her eyes, the kind that comes naturally to anyone stuck on a highway after dark. "I've been at this for half an hour," she said, gesturing at the stubborn tire. "I thought I knew how to do this, but these nuts won't budge." She introduced herself as Amy, explaining she was already running late for her night shift at the children's ward. Tom positioned his flashlight to better illuminate the work area and got down on one knee, not minding the wet asphalt soaking through his jeans. The wind whipped around them as he worked, explaining each step as he went along. "These lug nuts can be tricky," he said, using his body weight to break their grip. "The key is to loosen them in a star pattern before jacking up the car." While he worked, Amy held his flashlight, and they talked about their days. She told him about the little boy who had finally gotten to ring the remission bell that morning, and he shared stories about the vintage Mustang he was restoring in his garage. The conversation flowed naturally, making the task feel lighter despite the heavy weather. What neither of them noticed was the police cruiser that had quietly pulled up behind them, its lights off but dash cam recording. The officer inside watched intently, making notes on a small pad. 20 minutes later, the spare tire was securely in place. Amy reached for her wallet, but Tom waved it away with a smile. "My grandfather would roll over in his grave if I took money for helping someone in need," he said, wiping his hands on a shop rag. As Amy drove away with a grateful wave, Tom stood for a moment in the rain, watching her taillights disappear into the darkness. He couldn't know it then, but this simple act of kindness was about to set in motion a chain of events that would turn his whole world upside down. The police cruiser remained still, its presence unknown to Tom as he climbed back into his truck, thinking only of the hot shower waiting for him at home. Sometimes the biggest changes in our lives come from the smallest decisions, like stopping to help a stranger on a rainy evening. The rain had finally let up by the time Tom finished changing the tire, but the kindness he showed that evening would soon prove to be more significant than he could have imagined. As he worked on the flat tire, he and Amy discovered they both shared a love for old movies and weekend hiking, those simple conversations that make strangers feel like old friends. "My dad always told me there aren't enough good people left in the world," Amy said, holding the flashlight steady while Tom tightened the last lug nut. "I guess he was wrong." She smiled, her scrubs still dripping from the earlier downpour. The passing cars created a rhythmic swooshing sound, their headlights casting long shadows on the wet pavement. Tom just shrugged, his weathered hands working efficiently. "Honestly, I think there are plenty of good people out there. We just don't hear about them much on the news." He stood up, wiping the road grime off his hands with an old red shop rag. News folks aren't usually interested in stories about someone just doing the right thing. When Amy tried to hand him a $20 bill, Tom backed away with his hands up, chuckling. "No way. Save it for a cup of coffee during your night shift." He could see she was about to protest, so he added, "Tell you what, next time you see someone who needs help, just pay it forward. That's worth more than money." What neither of them realized was that Officer Chen was parked about 50 yards behind them, observing their interaction. She'd been tracking a hit-and-run case that had left an elderly man in critical condition just hours earlier. The suspect's vehicle description matched dozens of trucks in the area, including Tom's, and every lead needed to be followed. As Amy drove away, Tom took a moment to check his phone. 3 missed calls from his sister about their mom's upcoming birthday celebration. A text from his buddy at the auto shop about covering a shift tomorrow. Normal life stuff. He had no idea that this ordinary evening was about to become anything but ordinary. The police cruiser's presence remained unnoticed as Tom packed up his tools. The officer inside was taking detailed notes, watching as he carefully stored his jack and toolbox in the truck bed. From her angle, his dark blue pickup looked remarkably similar to the one witnesses had described fleeing the accident scene earlier that day. Before climbing back into his truck, Tom looked up at the clearing sky. The rain clouds had parted just enough to show a few stars peeking through. His grandfather used to say that helping others was like those stars, small lights that help guide people home. The old man had been gone for 5 years now, but Tom still lived by his words. The evening air had grown colder, and Tom's wet clothes clung uncomfortably to his skin. All he could think about was getting home, taking a hot shower, and maybe catching the end of the baseball game. He didn't know that in less than 48 hours, his simple act of kindness would become the center of a police investigation that would turn his quiet life upside down. As he pulled away from the shoulder, his truck's tires splashing through puddles, Officer Chen started her engine too. She had a job to do, and right now, that job involved finding out everything she could about the blue pickup truck and its driver who'd stopped to help a stranger on this rainy evening. The highway stretched out before them, streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement like a string of pearls disappearing into the distance. Sometimes the smallest choices we make, like stopping to help someone with a flat tire, can lead to the biggest moments in our lives. And Tom's biggest moment was just around the corner. 2 days after helping Amy with the flat tire, Tom was elbow-deep in an old Chevrolet's engine when his coworker Pete called out from the front of the shop. "Hey, there's someone here to see you." The tone in Pete's voice made Tom look up. Something wasn't quite right. Wiping his hands on his work pants, Tom walked to the front office and found himself face to face with a woman in a blazer, holding a badge. "I'm Detective Wilson," she said, her expression professional but warm. "Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Tom's heart did a little jump. The kind you get when you see police lights in your rearview mirror, even when you know you've done nothing wrong. "Of course," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Pete gave him a concerned look before stepping out, the bell above the shop door jingling as he left. The detective pulled out her phone and showed Tom a grainy traffic camera image. "This was taken on Highway 16 2 nights ago," she explained. "Around 7:15 p.m., there was a hit-and-run accident. The victim was Mr. Lee, a 68-year-old grandfather who was checking his mail." She paused, letting the information sink in. "He's in critical condition at City General." Tom felt his stomach tighten. He knew Highway 16 well. It was the same road where he'd helped Amy. The detective continued, her eyes studying his reactions. "Several witnesses described a dark blue pickup truck leaving the scene. We noticed your truck in the area about 30 minutes after the incident." "I was helping someone change a flat tire," Tom said quickly, his mind racing back to that rainy evening. "A nurse. She was heading to work. You can ask her." The words tumbled out faster than he intended, his hands unconsciously gripping the edge of Pete's desk. Detective Wilson nodded, making notes in her small leather notebook. "We're aware of that. Actually, that's partly why I'm here. We need to account for everyone in the area that evening." She looked up at him. "Would you mind showing me your truck?" Outside, the morning sun made the puddles from yesterday's rain sparkle like broken glass. Tom led the detective to his pickup, parked in the employee section. His grandfather's old toolbox still sat in the bed where he'd left it after helping Amy. The witnesses mentioned the suspect's vehicle had front-end damage. Detective Wilson said, walking slowly around Tom's truck. Her trained eyes scanned every inch of the vehicle. Tom stood there, his work shirt sticking to his back despite the cool morning air. As she completed her inspection, a call came through on her radio. Tom couldn't make out the words, but he saw something change in the detective's expression. She answered briefly, then turned back to him. "Thank you for your time," she said, but her tone had shifted slightly. Tom couldn't tell if that was good or bad. "We may need to speak with you again. Please don't leave town for the next few days." As Detective Wilson drove away, Pete came back out to the shop. "Everything okay?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Tom just shook his head, not sure how to answer. "Remember that flat tire I helped with Tuesday night?" Tom said finally. "Turns out there was a hit and run on that same road. They're questioning everyone who was in the area." He leaned against his truck, suddenly feeling very tired. Pete let out a low whistle. "Man, no good deed goes unpunished, huh?" He meant it as a joke, but neither of them laughed. Back inside the shop, Tom tried to focus on the Chevrolet's engine, but his mind kept wandering. Somewhere in the city, an elderly man was fighting for his life in a hospital bed. Somewhere else, someone with a damaged blue pickup was probably hiding their vehicle, hoping not to get caught. And here he was, stuck in the middle of it all because he'd stopped to help a stranger change a tire. The sound of wrenches and air tools filled the garage, but for the first time in his career, the familiar noises brought no comfort. Something told him this was just the beginning of a much bigger story. Word spreads fast in a small town. By the end of the week, Tom noticed the subtle changes in how people looked at him. The regular customers at Pete's auto shop, who usually stayed for friendly chats while their cars were being serviced, now barely made eye contact. The morning coffee shop, where he'd gotten his daily cup for 5 years, felt different too. He could feel the whispers following him like shadows. "Don't let it get to you," Pete said one morning, watching another customer hurry away after dropping off their keys. "People love drama. Next week they'll find something else to talk about." But Tom could see the worry in his old friend's eyes. The local news hadn't helped. Their evening report had mentioned a person of interest driving a dark blue pickup truck, and somehow, everyone seemed to know it was Tom they were talking about. They didn't mention his name, but in a town this size, it didn't matter. His sister called that evening, her voice tight with concern. "Mom's worried sick, you know. She saw the news." There was a pause on the line. "Why didn't you tell us about the police questioning you?" Tom sighed, sitting heavily on his living room couch. "Because it's nothing. I was just in the wrong place at the right time, helping someone with a flat tire. That's all." But even as he said it, he knew how it sounded. The timing, the matching truck description, being in the exact area of the hit and run. It all looked bad from the outside. The next day at work, Tom was replacing brake pads when he overheard 2 customers talking near the waiting area. "I heard he's the one," a woman whispered, not quietly enough. "My cousin's friend is a dispatcher. Says they found paint chips at the scene that match his truck." Tom's hands tightened on the wrench. That was impossible. He hadn't hit anyone. He'd spent that entire evening helping Amy with her tire. But how could he prove it? The rain had been pouring, the highway was dark, and besides Amy, nobody else had really seen them together. Pete tried to keep things normal at the shop, but Tom could tell he was worried too. "Maybe you should take a few days off," he suggested gently. "Let things cool down a bit." But Tom refused. Taking time off would only make him look guilty. That afternoon, Detective Wilson returned to the shop. This time, she wasn't alone. Another officer accompanied her, carrying what looked like a camera and some evidence bags. "We need to take some photos of your truck," she explained. "Standard procedure." As they documented every angle of his pickup, Tom noticed a small crowd gathering across the street. Phones were out, probably recording everything. By tonight, it would be all over social media. His grandfather had always said reputation was everything in a small town. It took years to build and seconds to destroy. The detective's questions were more pointed this time. Where exactly were you between 7 o'clock and 7:15 p.m. that evening? Can anyone besides the nurse verify your location? Have you had any recent work done on your truck's front end? Each question felt like another brick in a wall being built around him. Tom answered truthfully, but he could hear how weak his responses sounded. I was driving home from work. No, nobody else saw us. No, I haven't had any repairs done recently. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the shop's parking lot, Tom watched the detective drive away. Pete walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. This will all blow over, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Inside his truck, Tom found a small note tucked under his windshield wiper. How do you sleep at night? It read in angry handwriting. He crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash, trying to ignore the knot in his stomach. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Tom thought about Mr. Lee, still fighting for his life in the hospital. He thought about Amy, wondering if she'd heard about all this. And he thought about the real hit-and-run driver, who was out there somewhere, letting an innocent man take the blame for their crime. Little did he know, the next 24 hours would change everything. Amy sat in the break room of the children's hospital, scrolling through her phone during a rare quiet moment in her shift. The local news app's notification caught her eye. Hit-and-run investigation continues. Local mechanic under scrutiny. Her heart skipped a beat as she clicked on the article. The coffee she'd been drinking suddenly went cold in her hand as she read about a blue pickup truck, Highway 16, and the evening of the accident. The same evening. The same highway. Her mind raced back to the man who'd stopped to help her. Tom. The kind mechanic who'd refused to take any money for changing her tire. This can't be right, she whispered to herself, drawing curious looks from a fellow nurse. The article mentioned the hit-and-run occurred just 30 minutes before Tom had helped her. Something about the timing nagged at her mind, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Then it hit her, her dashcam. She'd installed it just 2 weeks ago, after a minor fender bender in the hospital parking lot. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her things, nearly knocking over her coffee cup. I need to take my break now. She called out to the charge nurse, her voice urgent. It's important. The walk to her car in the hospital parking garage felt like the longest of her life. Sitting in her car, Amy's fingers fumbled with the dashcam's memory card. The tiny piece of plastic might hold the key to proving Tom's innocence. She plugged it into her phone, heart pounding as she scrolled through the footage. There it was, Tuesday evening, timestamp 7:12 p.m. Through the rain-streaked windshield, she could see a dark blue pickup truck speeding past her. Definitely not Tom's. This one had a distinct dent in its passenger door and what looked like a ladder rack on top. The footage was brief but clear, even through the rain. Just minutes later, her own flat tire forced her to pull over. The camera kept recording as she struggled with the lug nuts, and then came the moment when Tom's truck pulled up behind her, hazard lights flashing. The timestamp was clear, 7:45 p.m. Amy's hands shook as she replayed the footage. She'd been so focused on her flat tire that evening, she hadn't noticed the other truck speeding past. But her dashcam had caught everything. Without wasting another minute, she dialed the police number from the news article. I need to speak with Detective Wilson, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. It's about the hit-and-run case on Highway 16. I have video evidence. The detective's voice was cautious but interested. Can you describe what you found? Amy explained about her dashcam, the speeding truck, and most importantly, the clear footage of Tom stopping to help her afterwards. Stay right there, Detective Wilson said. I'm sending an officer to collect the footage. This could be important evidence. While waiting, Amy scrolled through local social media, her heart sinking as she saw the comments about Tom. People he'd probably known for years were already condemning him. One post showed a photo of his auto shop with the caption, "Would you trust your car to someone who runs from an accident?" The weight of what she'd discovered pressed heavily on her chest. If she hadn't installed that dashcam, if she hadn't checked the news today, if she hadn't made the connection, an innocent man's life could have been ruined. A knock on her car window made her jump. A young officer stood there, notepad in hand. As she handed over her dashcam's memory card, she felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Relief that she could help clear Tom's name, but anxiety about whether the footage would be enough. "Thank you for coming forward," the officer said, carefully bagging the memory card. "You'd be surprised how many people see something but say nothing." Back in the hospital, Amy's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Wilson. "Footage received. Please don't discuss this with anyone yet. We'll be in touch." Amy looked out the hospital window at the setting sun, thinking about how one small decision, installing a dashcam after a minor accident, was about to change everything. Sometimes the truth comes from the most unexpected places, captured by a tiny lens on a rainy evening. Detective Wilson sat at her desk, the glow of her computer screen illuminating her focused expression. It was nearly midnight, but she couldn't stop watching Amy's dashcam footage. The dark blue pickup truck that sped past had distinct features: a dented passenger door, a ladder rack, and most importantly, clear damage to its front end. She rewound the video again, this time focusing on the timestamp, 7:12 p.m. Everything about this truck matched the witnesses' descriptions perfectly. The detective reached for her coffee, now cold and forgotten, as pieces of the puzzle finally started falling into place. Her phone buzzed. The lab results had come in. The paint chips found at the accident scene didn't match Tom's truck after all. She'd been right to trust her gut feeling about him. But procedure had demanded she follow every lead. Across town, Tom lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The last few days had felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. His phone lit up with a text. Pete checking in on him again. "Hang in there, buddy. Truth always comes out." The next morning brought a flurry of activity to the police station. Detective Wilson's team had worked through the night, enhancing the dashcam footage. The truck's license plate was partially visible, blurred by rain but still readable with the right software. "Got it," called out Officer Chen from the computer lab. "Plate matches a vehicle registered to a local construction company." She pulled up the registration details, her eyes widening. "Boss, you need to see this." The construction company's owner had reported the truck stolen 2 days after the accident. A convenient coincidence, too convenient. Detective Wilson grabbed her keys. "Get me the owner's home address." Meanwhile, at Pete's auto shop, Tom was trying to lose himself in his work. The familiar smell of motor oil and the rhythmic sound of tools against metal usually brought him peace, but not today. The morning news had run another story about the hit and run, showing his shop in the background. His phone rang. Detective Wilson's number. His heart raced as he answered. "Can you come down to the station?" she asked, her tone different from before. "There's something you need to see." The police station felt different this time. No suspicious glances, no whispered conversations as he walked through. Detective Wilson met him in the lobby, a slight smile on her face. "We have the dashcam footage," she explained, leading him to a small conference room. As Tom watched the video, emotions washed over him like waves. There it was. Proof. The real hit-and-run vehicle, clearly not his truck, speeding past Amy's car. Then, minutes later, footage of him pulling over to help with the flat tire. "We've identified the actual vehicle," Detective Wilson said, sliding a photo across the table. "It belongs to a local construction company. The owner reported it stolen after the accident, but our investigation suggests otherwise." Tom stared at the photo, his hands shaking slightly. The truck in the image was nearly identical to his, but the dented door and ladder rack made it distinctly different. "So, I'm cleared?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Completely, she replied. We're issuing a press release within the hour. The real suspect is being brought in for questioning as we speak. She paused, looking at him thoughtfully. I owe you an apology for what you've been through. Outside the station, the morning sun felt warmer somehow. Tom pulled out his phone to call Pete with the news, but it was already ringing. Amy calling. I saw the news, she exclaimed. I'm so glad the footage helped. I couldn't stand seeing them blame you for something you didn't do. As Tom drove back to the shop, he noticed people on the street waving at him again. News traveled fast in their small town, both the bad and the good. His phone kept buzzing with messages of support and apologies from those who doubted him. Pete was waiting outside the shop, grinning from ear to ear. I told you the truth would come out, he said, pulling Tom into a bear hug. Now how about we get back to fixing cars? We've got customers waiting. Tom nodded, feeling the weight of the past few days finally lifting from his shoulders. Sometimes, he thought, a single act of kindness, like stopping to help someone with a flat tire, can lead to unexpected consequences. But in the end, the truth has a way of finding its light. The local news vans gathered outside the police station early that morning, their satellite dishes reaching up into the crisp autumn air. Inside, Detective Wilson stood before a crowd of reporters, her voice steady as she delivered the breaking news. Thanks to a crucial piece of dashcam evidence and thorough investigation, we have arrested the real suspect in the Highway 16 hit-and-run case, she announced. The room buzzed with camera clicks and hurried whispers. The owner of River City Construction, Mr. Thompson, is now in custody. Back at City General Hospital, Mr. Lee's daughter sat beside her father's bed, tears streaming down her face as she watched the press conference on her tablet. Her father, still recovering but now conscious, squeezed her hand weakly. The truth had finally come out. The investigation had revealed an unsettling story. Thompson had been driving home from a job site that rainy evening, possibly after having a few drinks at a local bar. After hitting Mr. Lee, he panicked and fled the scene. Later, he reported his truck stolen to cover his tracks, thinking he'd gotten away with it. What he hadn't counted on was a kind mechanic stopping to help a stranded nurse that same evening, or that nurse's dashcam capturing the crucial evidence that would unravel his whole story. At Pete's auto shop, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Local news stations wanted interviews, old customers called to apologize for doubting Tom, and new customers wanted to book appointments with the honest mechanic, as social media had dubbed him. You're famous now, Pete joked, watching Tom try to keep up with the calls. Just don't forget us little people when Hollywood comes calling. Tom just shook his head, smiling as he worked on an old Ford's transmission. Amy stopped by the shop during her lunch break, still wearing her hospital scrubs. I brought you something, she said, holding up a paper bag. Inside was a fresh apple pie from the local bakery. It's not much, but I wanted to thank you properly for helping me that night. If you hadn't stopped. Tom looked at the pie, thinking about how one simple decision had led to all of this. I'm the one who should thank you, he replied. If it wasn't for your dashcam. The afternoon brought another visitor to the shop, Detective Wilson. This time, she wasn't there to ask questions. Instead, she handed Tom an official letter from the police department, clearing his name and apologizing for any distress caused during the investigation. There's something else, she said, pulling out a second envelope. Mr. Lee's family asked me to give you this. Inside was a handwritten note, thanking Tom for his indirect role in solving the case. They invited him to visit Mr. Lee once he was stronger. Word of the story spread beyond their small town. A regional news station picked it up, focusing on how a random act of kindness had helped solve a serious crime. Their headline read, Good Samaritan's Choice Leads to Justice. The construction company owner's arrest sent ripples through the community. Other business owners came forward with stories about his reckless behavior in the past. The police investigation expanded, uncovering a pattern of covered-up incidents. That evening, Tom visited the hospital. Mr. Lee was sitting up in bed, looking frail but alert. His daughter stood nearby as Tom entered the room. "So you're the young man who helped solve this," Mr. Lee said softly. "Please, sit down." They talked for almost an hour. Mr. Lee shared stories about his grandchildren, and Tom told him about learning auto repair from his grandfather. Sometimes the worst situations bring out the best connections between people. As Tom drove home that night, he passed the spot on Highway 16 where he'd helped Amy with her tire. The road looked different now, not just a stretch of asphalt, but a place where a simple choice to help someone had changed multiple lives. His phone buzzed with a text from Pete. "Local paper wants to do a feature story tomorrow. Should I tell them you're available?" Tom smiled, thinking about how his grandfather would have handled all this attention. "Tell them yes," he replied. "But make sure they mention that anyone would have done the same thing." The truth was, not everyone would have stopped that rainy night. But those who choose kindness, even when it's inconvenient, sometimes end up making a bigger difference than they could ever imagine. The local newspaper's headline read, "One kind act sparks community change." The story of Tom, Amy, and the hit-and-run case had touched something deep in their small town's heart. It wasn't just about solving a crime anymore. It had become about something bigger. Morning regulars at the downtown diner couldn't stop talking about it. "You know," said old Mr. Wilson, stirring his coffee, "my daughter now keeps her headlights on whenever she sees someone pulled over. Says it's because of Tom's story." Others nodded in agreement, sharing their own stories of recent roadside kindness. The town council called a special meeting. The mayor, a usually reserved woman in her 60s, spoke passionately about community spirit. "What happened here shows us two things," she said, her voice carrying across the packed room. "First, how quickly we can judge others. And second, how one person's kindness can change everything." At the children's hospital, Amy found herself telling the story to her young patients. Sometimes the scariest moments can lead to the best changes, she explained to a wide-eyed 7-year-old getting ready for surgery. The child's mother wiped away tears, understanding it wasn't just a story about a flat tire anymore. Local high schools invited Tom to speak at their assemblies. At first, he tried to decline. Public speaking wasn't his thing. But Pete convinced him. "These kids need to hear it from someone real," he insisted. "Someone who just did the right thing without expecting anything in return." Standing before hundreds of teenagers, Tom kept it simple. "I'm not special," he told them, his hand slightly shaking as he held the microphone. "I just did what my grandfather taught me. Help others when you can. You never know how far that help might reach." The story caught fire on social media. A video of Tom's speech went viral, reaching far beyond their small town. Comments poured in from across the country. "This restored my faith in humanity. We need more people like this. Kindness matters." Mr. Lee's recovery became a community project. People brought meals to his family, offered rides to medical appointments, and even started a fundraiser for his medical bills. His daughter was overwhelmed by the support. "Dad's accident was terrible," she told a local reporter, "but look at how it brought everyone together." The police department launched a new initiative called Highway Heroes, a program encouraging people to help others safely on the road. Detective Wilson made sure both Tom and Amy were recognized at the launch ceremony. "Sometimes the best police work happens because ordinary citizens choose to do extraordinary things," she said. Local businesses joined in. Pete's Auto Shop started offering free basic car safety checks. Other mechanics in town followed suit. The local hardware store began stocking emergency road kits at discounted prices. Even the small diners along Highway 16 put up signs offering free coffee to anyone who helped a stranded motorist. One evening, as Tom closed up the shop, a young couple pulled in with a crying baby in the backseat. Their car had been making strange noises, and they were scared to drive further. Without hesitation, Tom grabbed his tools. An hour later, they were back on the road, their gratitude evident in their eyes. "You didn't have to stay late," the young father said, trying to offer payment. Tom just smiled and shook his head. "Pass it on when you can," he replied, thinking about how many times he'd said those words since that rainy night. The local news did a follow-up story 1 month after Thompson's arrest. They interviewed random people on the street about how the incident had changed their community. One elderly woman summed it up perfectly. "We were always a good town, but this reminded us who we really are." That evening, Tom sat in his grandfather's old chair, reading through messages from people he'd never met. Each one shared a story of how they'd been inspired to help others. Some were big gestures, others small, but all of them mattered. His phone buzzed. Another text from Amy. She'd just helped someone jump-start their car in the hospital parking lot. "Guess you started something," she wrote. Tom smiled, thinking about how his grandfather would have loved all this. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. In their small town, people had started saying there were two kinds of luck: bad luck that brings you trouble, and good luck that brings you someone like Tom when trouble finds you. The truth was, it was never about luck at all. It was about choosing kindness, even when nobody's watching. 1 year had passed since that rainy evening on Highway 16. The morning sun sparkled off the fresh paint of Pete's auto shop, where a small crowd had gathered for what the town now called Good Neighbor Day. The mayor stood near a makeshift podium, her voice carrying across the parking lot. "Who would have thought," she began, "that a flat tire would change our whole community?" The crowd chuckled, many nodding in agreement. Among them stood Tom, still uncomfortable with attention, but learning to accept it gracefully. Amy was there too, wearing her hospital scrubs. She'd just finished a night shift, but wouldn't miss this for anything. Next to her, Mr. Lee sat in a folding chair, fully recovered and smiling broadly. His grandchildren played nearby, wearing little t-shirts that read "Kindness Matters." The past year had brought changes nobody could have predicted. The Highway Heroes program had spread to neighboring towns, with over 50 documented cases of people helping stranded motorists. Local businesses had joined forces to create an emergency response network, ensuring nobody was ever stranded for long. "Remember when we could barely get anyone to stop for a flat tire?" An elderly woman whispered to her friend. "Now you can't get a flat without 3 people pulling over to help." They both laughed, but the truth in her words was clear. Tom stepped up to the podium, pulling a wrinkled piece of paper from his pocket. He'd never gotten used to public speaking, but some stories needed to be told. "My grandfather used to say that tools aren't just for fixing cars, they're for fixing problems." "Any problems?" He paused, looking at the familiar faces in the crowd. "This past year, I've seen people fix all kinds of problems. Not just flat tires or broken engines, but broken trust, broken spirits, and broken connections." The local high school had started a mechanical skills program, with Tom teaching weekend classes. "It's not just about cars," he'd tell his students. "It's about being ready to help when help is needed." Several of his students were there today, wearing their workshop aprons with pride. Detective Wilson stood at the back of the crowd, smiling. Her department had recorded a significant increase in citizens reporting crimes and offering to help with investigations. The dashcam program she'd started, inspired by Amy's footage, had helped solve several other cases. "But the real story," Tom continued, his voice growing stronger, "isn't about one person or one night. It's about what happens when people remember to look out for each other." He gestured to the crowd. "It's about all of you." The applause was interrupted by the sound of screeching tires. Everyone turned to see a car pulling into the lot, smoke coming from under the hood. Without missing a beat, 3 people rushed to help, including one of Tom's teenage students, toolbox already in hand. Mr. Lee's daughter stepped forward, holding a large photo album. "We've been collecting stories," she explained, opening it to reveal hundreds of pictures and handwritten notes. "Every person who's been helped or helped someone else this year. They're all in here." The album passed through the crowd, pages filled with stories of midnight rescues, rainy day repairs, and roadside assistance. But more than that, they were stories of connections made, friendships formed, and community strengthened. Amy took the microphone next, still in her scrubs. "You know what's amazing?" she asked. "In the hospital, we're seeing more patients come in with someone who helped them, staying until family arrives. That never used to happen." As the ceremony wound down, people lingered, sharing stories and making plans. The local coffee shop had set up a stand, giving out free cups to everyone, just like they'd been doing for stranded motorists all year. Tom found himself standing next to his old truck, the one that had once been under suspicion. Pete walked up, grinning. "You know what's funny?" he said. "That truck of yours has probably inspired more good deeds than any other vehicle in town." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the crowd slowly dispersed, but the feeling of connection remained. Tom watched as Amy helped Mr. Lee to his car, his grandchildren skipping alongside. Detective Wilson chatted with some of the auto shop students about their latest projects. This wasn't just a one-year celebration. It was a new beginning. In a world that often seemed divided, their small town had discovered something precious: the simple power of choosing kindness, one person at a time. As Tom turned to head back into the shop, a car pulled in with its hazard lights blinking. Without hesitation, 3 people were already walking toward it, ready to help. He smiled, knowing his grandfather would have loved to see this. Sometimes the best endings are really just new beginnings in disguise.